welcome to part 2 of how porn affects the brain. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, I urge you to go and do so first and then come back to this one. Alright, so as you remember, these are the 4 addiction-related brain changes that we are dealing with here. And in part 1 we talked a lot about desensitization. But did you know that desensitization can actually take place to a certain extent even if you're not addicted? Now, desensitization often becomes much more severe if you are really addicted, obviously. But I repeat, you don't have to be an addict in order to knock out some of the dopamine receptors. And if you're not really addicted and you stop hammering them, they will also grow back sooner than if you have a full-blown addiction. Now, this is just one reason behind why guys who give up porn tend to see such a different timeline of when they start to feel better, because some probably quit before the other addiction-related brain changes have set in, while others are dealing with all of the brain changes. Alright, so the second brain change is called sensitization. It kind of sounds like desensitization, but it's nothing like that at all. What sensitization is that it's basically a memory of pleasure. So even though you are desensitized and numb when having an addiction, there is actually one thing you become more sensitive to, and that is triggers. Yes, that's right. And that's probably why it's called sensitization as well. And if you don't know what a trigger is, it is basically anything that reminds your brain of your drug of choice. So for a porn addict, a trigger could, for example, be seeing a hot fitness model on Instagram or a booty shaking video on YouTube and so on. And then those things trigger you to go and watch some real hardcore porn. Alright, so check this out. Whenever we learn a new habit or try to memorize a new thing, you are forming pathways in your brain. It is like you are walking in a field of grass. At first, it's heavy going, but the more you keep walking that exact same route, with time you form a rut or a small road in the grass, and now it's much easier to walk there. In fact, it is now easier to walk there than to not walk there. Well, you can think of these small roads in the grass as habits with normal day-to-day activities. But then with sensitization, that road in the grass is more like a super highway. Yeah, so sensitization is a super memory of pleasure. And whenever you are hit by a trigger, those sensitized pathways in your brain, well, they light up and start screaming for your drug. Yeah, so sensitization is what gives you those powerful cravings that can make you relapse back to your drug and blow away all your good intentions. Now here comes something really interesting about this. Many people are now probably thinking, well, I guess I'm not addicted then, because I wouldn't say I feel strong cravings to use porn. I'm just a bit horny at times, that's all. Well, here's the deal. I myself did not know I was addicted until I tried giving it up. And the reason for why I wanted to give up the porn was because I was struggling with weak erections. And when I read that porn could cause things like that, I decided to give it up for 90 days to see if they would improve. And then, to my big surprise, it was then I found out that I was actually not able to do it. I would go for 2 or 3 weeks without the porn, sometimes 4 or 5 weeks. But then I always relapsed back to it. And I kept relapsing for more than 7 years before I finally reached my goal of 90 days. Even though I was 100% determined to get to 90 days, I just couldn't do it. And listen to this, I had never been a heavy porn user either. I was only using it once or twice a week. But when I tried to give it up, I found that I just couldn't do it. And despite not using it on a daily basis, it still gave me many of the negative effects we talked about in part 1, including libido and erection problems. Now granted, my porn sessions were sometimes very, very long, because I was clearly clicking from video to video to video, always chasing the next one. Now here's the thing, even if you really are addicted to porn, if you always use your porn whenever you're horny, the sensitized pathways won't start screaming at you. That only happens if you try to not use your drug. When I started trying to give up the porn, always when I got to my second or third week, whenever I got hit by a trigger, then I got to experience how powerful urges can really be. The sensitized pathways can even have such a big effect on you that your hands start trembling. I still remember the very first time that happened to me. My hands literally started trembling when I was hit by a visual trigger, and my heart started pounding in my chest. I didn't know it back then, but what was happening to me in that very moment was that those porn pathways in my brain, those sensitized pathways, were firing up like a Christmas tree. So again, the sensitized pathways may not show themselves to you before you had tried to give up your drug. Yeah, so if you think you're not addicted to porn, try giving it up for 60 or 90 days as an experiment. Then you'll find out. And I'm not saying you are. Maybe you are not addicted. But if you set a goal for yourself of 90 days without porn, it can be a really good experiment to find out where you stand. So here's the thing to remember. The nasty thing about the sensitized pathways is that they always become a bit stronger in the second and even stronger in the third week after quitting an addiction. But once you get over that hump and you get more than a month in or so, then they will slowly but surely start to become weaker and weaker. However, sensitization is nasty because once you are addicted, this is a brain change that will never really go away completely as long as you live. Now, they do become weaker, become dormant and fall asleep, so to speak. So it's not like you're going to have to deal with extreme urges for the rest of your life. But since they are only sleeping later on, it also means that they can easily be woken up. You may, for example, have heard that most sober alcoholics can't even drink one beer again, because if they do, they will relapse and start drinking heavily again. Well, now you know why. It's because if they try to drink in moderation, they can wake up those sleeping sensitized pathways. Yes, and so the sensitized pathways never fully go away. And it's the same with all addictions, porn addiction as well. Alright, so the third brain change is called hypofrontality. Hypo means less than normal, and frontality refers to the part of your brain that is right behind your forehead. And this part of your brain is called prefrontal cortex. So then hypofrontality basically means less than normal functioning prefrontal cortex. And hypofrontality means that you have less blood flow to your prefrontal cortex. And if you didn't know, your PFC is the very control center of your brain. It is responsible for things like, for example, self-control, impulse control, pondering consequences, attention and focus, and more. Now, if you look at the first two there, now you also understand why it becomes harder to avoid your drug if you truly have an addiction. Because if you have less blood flow to the part of your brain that governs impulse control and self-control, well, obviously you will have a harder time withstanding temptations then as well. Especially if you're suddenly hit by a trigger. I mean, just think about it. At that moment, wouldn't you think impulse control would be a great thing to have? I think we can all agree on that, yes. And listen to this. What's so nasty about hypofrontality is that when the sensitized pathways light up, then the hypofrontality actually becomes temporarily even worse. Yeah, so when the porn pathways start screaming in your brain, you get even less blood flow to your already negatively affected PFC. So it really becomes a double whammy here. And so no wonder that it can be difficult to not relapse and fall for urges if you really have developed a real addiction. And if you look at this one here. Now you also understand why concentration and focus problems, like I mentioned in part 1, can become an issue, especially when you consider that desensitization also plays a role in that. So here too, a real double whammy takes place. Now, unlike sensitization, this brain change can actually reverse completely once you quit your drug of choice. And we are going to talk more about reversing the brain changes in part 3 of the video series, where we will also take a look at the fourth and the last one of these addiction-related brain changes. You can see that video on the screen right here, and if you can't see it yet, you know the drill. It just means that you have to wait until I'm done working with it and it gets published. But click on that right now and I'll see you over there.